Will racial equality ever be achieved by law? By Julio Flores. There's division on the success of the civil rights movement. White Americans and African Americans and Latinos are sharply divided over the successes and failures of the civil rights movement. African Americans are deeply disillusioned about the future. At the turn of the millennium, 71% of African Americans believe racial equality would not be achieved in their lifetimes or would not be achieved at all. 73% of African Americans believe they were economically worse off than whites. White Americans, on the other hand, are unduly sanguine about the state of black America. According to the recent survey, a majority of whites think blacks are worse off than whites themselves are, but 38% think blacks' economic status is about the same as their own. 50% of whites think America has achieved racial equality and access to health care, and 44% think African Americans have jobs that are about the same as those of whites. Racial segregation. In 1896, most white Americans approved of racial segregation, and most of the justices of the Supreme Court thought it was plainly constitutional. In 1954, the justices unanimously invalidated segregation, and about half of all Americans agreed with that ruling. How should we understand this dramatic shift in popular and legal opinion? How much is attributable to extra-legal factors, and how much to law? Clearly, changes in the social and political context of race relations preceded and accounted for changes in judicial decision-making. This is not to say that the court decisions did not matter, only that they reflected social attitudes and practices more than they created them. The justices in Brown understood this, commenting on the spectacular advances, the great changes, and the constant progress being made in race relations. In the absence of such changes, Brown would not have been decided as it was, as the justices themselves observed. Court decisions do matter, though often in unpredictable ways, but they cannot fundamentally transform a nation. The justices are too much products of their time and place to launch social revolutions, and even if they had the inclination to do so, their capacity to coerce change is too heavily constrained. The justices were not tempted to invalidate school segregation until a time when half the nation supported such a ruling. They declined to aggressively enforce the Brown decision until the civil rights movement had made Northern whites as keen to eliminate Jim Crow as Southern whites were to preserve it. And while Brown did play a role in shaping both the civil rights movement and the violent response it received from Southern whites, deep background forces ensured that the United States would experience a racial reform movement regardless of what the Supreme Court did or did not do.
It's a good question. We've come a long way, actually, because of the laws that are in place to guarantee everyone, equal access to all these public, places, and as taxpayers we are and so forth. But we've come a long way. However, there's always that but, depending where you're at. We've come a long way from the distant waters, as they called it, where you couldn't go to the pools on any day of the week because you were of a certain Chicano or black. So that is it's no longer, if you will, overt, right? The racism isn't overt, or the prejudice, so it's a little more hidden. But I think we've moved away from that for the most part, but there's still a legacy there because people are young people are raised with certain concepts or conditions about others, and if they're not familiar with certain communities, they may react to those communities, in a different form. They're not accustomed to sharing space with everybody, and when you try to share that space, you say, "Oh, wait a minute, is this right? Do you belong here?" Even though they might not say it, articulate it, but they might think it, just the way they react towards your presence in those places. Depends. I've been in Montana. I met some I've been in Wyoming, Cheyenne, Wyoming. I've been in South Dakota. And I don't see the prejudice there that I expected. I was pleased to see that people were actually very friendly towards my family and friends that we went up there. And then here in California, you might find some intolerance, So I don't think it's so much. I think we've come a long way today, where people are much more comfortable with one another. I hope that's the case. Of course, there's exceptions, I have a niece who lives in Alabama. She says it's pretty tough down there. But if you go to other parts of the country, I think you're okay. I think we've come a long way. But yeah, my dad talks about those places in the 1940s where they had to wait till midnight. They wouldn't wait till the one day of the week. They would literally go any day of the week, but after 10 o'clock when the pools were closed and the lifeguards went away. And he says that the cops would come and they would flash the light on all these young Mexican Americans in the pools at midnight. But so long as they didn't burn the pool down, which hard to do, they left them alone because they saw the unfairness of having these kids have to wait till the end of the week to go swimming. He said, well, no, as long as they're not causing trouble, let them be. So my dad's generation had to deal with some of those kinds of allowances, even though it wasn't fair. But yeah, that was a different time. The Zoot Suit riots created this whole hysteria about the Pachucos and who these kids were, and then the newspapers ran with these stories about these Zoot Suiters and these Pachucos and Mexican Americans. What happens here is when the newspapers and the press begin to interchangeably use the word Zoot Suiters with Pachucos as hoodlums, and then vicariously start also interjecting the word Mexican American, you start racializing that particular predicament. So that's how I show with my students, when you racialize crime, you criminalize race. So Zoot Suiters, they were being accused of this heightened crime that was occurring, which wasn't occurring. You are also racializing crime, and when you racialize crime, you criminalize those groups those people come from, so that we're all thrown under the bus together. And so that's happened with African Americans. We saw what happened to Japanese Americans during the same period of World War II. They were also racialized and therefore criminalized, and our government sent them to detention centers because they were perhaps they looked too much like the enemy. The Chinese had a hard time with that, Chinese Americans, because they were being mistaken for Japanese Americans. So they had in their stores, they had ABC stores. I don't know if you remember those, but it said ABCs. Chinese stores ran ABCs on top of their stores to read American-born Chinese, to keep away from the Japanese label during the war period, because they didn't want their stores burned down or vandalized because mistaken identity. So when we do that to our own people, whether they're Japanese American, Mexican American, Zoot Suiters, we create more problems than solutions, because we're putting in the minds of people, we're planting seeds in the minds of people that these people are dangerous.
With the Civil Rights Act in 1964, obviously, you're supposed to give rights to more people. But obviously, with Trump in office, we see a lot of his constituents have been mainly those who are white rural residents who maybe haven't even finished high school, so they may be competing with Latinos for the same types of jobs. Has it seemed that before it used to be politically incorrect to go ahead and to have prejudice, but now with Trump in office, it seems like it's gone back to where people are just saying and acting the way they feel in regards to prejudice? Do you agree with that?
No, when I was a kid, many years ago, there were signs up and down the state of California that said no dogs or Mexicans allowed. It was that bad. They wouldn't rent. Many hotels and motels would not rent to Mexicans. And if you went to the swimming pools, they wouldn't let you in until Friday, because that was the day that they changed the water. So I never thought that we would come back to those times where people would be so prejudicial, so discriminatory, so out and out, visible with their prejudices. And so we've gone to another time that many of us that are my age thought were over and done with. So it is because they've been emboldened by this president, who has a poor regard to people of color, whether they be black, brown, Asian, Pacific American, Native American, Muslims, and everybody else who isn't white and doesn't have the same culture.
It's difficult.
Yeah, do you feel that when Cesar Chavez was starting United Farm Workers and obviously trying to get better wages and better living conditions for the workers, was he also, in a sense, by having a better wage and better working conditions, trying to achieve racial equality as well?
That's a good question, because I'm not sure if Cesar Chavez saw the fundamental unfairness of racial inequality. Absolutely. And he was looking at it from a labor economic perspective. Sure. So I don't think he himself perhaps believed that racial equality would come from that, but it would allow Mexican American and Mexican farm workers to get a better hold of the situation in terms of their economics, where their children could not become farm workers and strive for better futures, right? Mm-hmm. I think that's what was at the heart of Cesar Chavez, is that he realized historically that our people, his people, Mexican Americans and Mexican nationals and others, Filipino Americans, they were at the bottom of the barrel because of, unfair labor exploitation and those things of the workforce. I would imagine too, though, in the back of his mind, he was pushing for racial inequality, although I think his more important primary concern was economic equality.
Yes.
Yeah, income, economic equality. I think that's what he was pushing for. And then from there, that's a good starting point.
If they were able to, conservatives would eliminate all government affirmative action programs and repeal Title VII. They got off to a good start in this direction after the 1980 election. The Reagan administration more or less gutted the federal government's contract compliance program, starting in 1965 with an executive order issued by President Lyndon B. Johnson. The federal contract compliance program mandates that all government contractors with contracts in excess of $50,000 and with 50 or more employees institute affirmative action plans. The order prohibits discrimination by contractors and requires contracting firms to take affirmative action to ensure that applicants are employed and employees are treated during employment without regard to their race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. Under this controversial program, the federal government monitored the racial composition of contractors' workforces and asked that firms set goals to remedy deficiencies. After Ronald Reagan's election, his administration sharply cut the budget of the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, reducing enforcement of the Contract Compliance Program. As Jonathan Leonard notes, fewer administrative complaints were filed, back pay awards were phased out, and the already rare penalty of debarment became an endangered species. For example, about 500 back pay awards were granted in fiscal year 1986, compared to 4,336 during the last year of the Carter administration.
Latinos are like everybody else. We come in all sizes and all shapes and all colors. And we're in all the professions that everybody else is in. We're lawyers and we're doctors and we're dentists and we're, haulers. We're out in the fields. We take care of children. We do everything that a lot of people do. So the tendency is always to see us in one or two different kinds of roles. That is, that we're out in the fields, or that we're taking care of children for somebody else, normally a white character. Now, we do that too. Of course we do. And there's nothing to be ashamed about, but it can't be that that's the only two job designations that we're constantly on the air about. People see that and they don't put a value on us. They don't put a value on us because they see us as characters, as individuals that can only do that kind of work. So that hurts us. How we are perceived is always going to be the way that we are treated. And as you know, we're not treated very well in this country right now. And it is to a large degree because we have a president that consistently throws Latinos under the bus. That we're criminals and they were here without documentation. I mean, you name it and it's there. And what he is allowed to do in this country is that a lot of people who don't even know us consider what he has to say and say, oh, yeah, for the president to say it, it must be so. So the stereotypes are not good. And if we're invisible in film or on television, the same difference. We don't count. And so people are going to think of us as Trump and all those other people around him think of us.
Latinos in Hollywood, that's Sangre Negra. Our cast is a diversity cast, and we play roles like any other roles, not only the immigrants that are coming from the border, or the babysitter, or the cleaning lady, or the gardener. Yes, we do those jobs too, and we're so proud to do those jobs. But our community, the Latinos here in the United States, we do all the other jobs too. We are in the government, we are in in social media, we are influencers in society, and we do a lot of good too.
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's, I think that's, I would like to put that seed too in Sangre Negra, that being Latina and being the mother and being the wife, taking care of my kids in the show and making sure that they go in a certain route to show our community that, you know what, it's up to us to deal with all the obstacles in life, like everybody else. Like here, we're talking, like they say, like white or yellow or, Latinos, we are here and we're here to stay because we are Americans.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yes.
Income inequality. United for a Fair Economy, a Boston-based nonprofit organization that focuses on economic equality, released its annual State of the Dream report, which concluded that since the civil rights movement 4 decades ago, blacks still only earn 57 cents and Latinos earn 59 cents for each dollar of white median family income. The contrast is even starker for net wealth, that is, the total value of investments, savings, homes, and other property minus any debt. Blacks hold only 10% of net wealth, and Latinos hold 12 cents for every dollar that whites hold.
We're striving for that as a society, as a country. However, I think racial equality won't happen necessarily until there's income equality, because they kind of go hand in hand. And it's, it tends to manifest itself racially. But income inequality has a lot to do with how you or people are socioeconomically stratified, because without income equality, people cannot strive for, a better life, let's say. Does that mean that we have a perpetual labor class which is color-coded? Perhaps. If Mexico was not south of our border and Pakistan was, then we'd have a large Pakistani, cheap labor class or undocumented. So, will we achieve racial equality? I would like to be the eternal optimist and say one day we will, but I'm also the eternal realist and saying, boy, that's going to be a hard one.
The numbers of Latinos in television, for instance, in front of camera is woefully low, 6%. We're 18% of the U.S. population. In film, we're 3.1% when we buy 24% of all the tickets at theaters. So the representation is terrible, and the studios get away with saying people of color when what they're doing is just hiring African Americans. And all the better for them. But there's room for everybody, I don't want what they've got. They've worked for it, but we've been working for it all our lives as well. So we deserve a shot at some of those roles. Now, in back of camera, as writers, directors, stagehands, etc., numbers are even worse. So Hollywood is in our backyard. The 6 studios, most powerful studios in the world are in our backyard. And we can't get standing there.
Speaking of economics, it seems that a lot of Trump's constituents and clientele, people who were voting for him, were maybe white Americans that maybe didn't have too much of an education, maybe barely graduated high school, maybe didn't. And that, looking at the statistics, that's what really put him in office. And the discernment is that they felt maybe they were being left out, and if they were at an economic disadvantage, they felt like anyone who was a minority was taking their jobs because they were doing the same kinds of jobs. And now it seems there's a little bit of a backlash, and now it seems that with Trump in office, this prejudice can be open, where before it was sort of like, oh, hush, hush, I don't want to say it because it's not politically correct, but now you're in a situation where people feel they can say, how is that going to hurt striving to have equality and economic equality and income equality?
It's interesting because Donald Trump, you're right, he resonates with this blue-collar, white working class communities who will feel they've been left out of all the international trade agreements, NAFTA, CAFTA, and so on and so forth. And there's truth to that, you know. And it's not just the Democratic Party's fault, it's also the Republican Party's fault, because they've created these free trade policies that have screwed, you know, for lack of a better word, working class people in this country. So now you have kind of this unstated class war. You know, it's this kind of, there's now these class divisions. Donald Trump is resonating very well with working class whites because they've been left out, so to speak. Especially with the, you know, the closures of our, you know, steel industries, our coal mining industries. You know, they have less jobs to, you know, fall back on. So they find themselves more and more probably in the same market, market forces that where Latinos and blacks are. So yeah, Donald Trump definitely resonates with those groups, which, you know, those are some of those nativist groups, the people that are feeling the xenophobia. You know, they're not feeling their worth as Americans anymore because suddenly they're competing with largely historic, you know, unskilled, or even though they were unskilled or minimally skilled, minority workforces. They don't like it. They resent it. And yet you have, in 1986, Ronald Reagan, you know, as president, supporting the Simpson-Mazzoli bill, which legalized millions of primarily Central Americans because of his anti-labor posturing. Labor has taken a blow in the last 30 years, so that one way to strike a death blow at organized labor in this country is to bring in a large pool of semi-skilled, minimally skilled to unskilled workforce, so that, again, big money wants to hire them so they won't have to pay American workers their fair wages. So now you have these class divisions and this kind of this class consciousness, and it comes down to economics. You know, why are we establishing these policies? Because the internationalists, if you will, you know, they profit from bringing in all these people from Mexico and Central and South America, or from China, but they're not asking the American people, how do you feel about it?
The new economic analysis in the book is relevant and important because of the changing demographics our country is undergoing. By 2043, the U.S. Census projects that the majority of people in the United States will be people of color, with the Latino community constituting the largest group. By 2050, Latinos will not only more double in size from 50 million today to 110 million, they will also make up 30% of the labor force. These facts bring a new sense of urgency to closing the racial disparities our community faces. To put it simply, the future of the U.S. rests in the hands of the communities of color, particularly Latinos. And yet the unsettling reality is that Latinos are not keeping pace with the educational demands to ensure the nation's economic competitiveness or their own. In 2012, 59% of the nation's jobs required post-secondary education and training beyond high school. During the recessions and recovery, only holders of bachelor degrees experienced positive job growth. Yet in 2012, only 30% of the Latinos had post-secondary education compared to 68% of non-Hispanic whites. And while it is true that Latinos are entering college at higher rates than in the past, they are unfortunately enrolling in colleges and universities that are underfunded, overcrowded, and not.
Do you think that racial equality will ever be achieved either by law or it just kind of happens eventually?
Eventually, 100 years from now?
Yes.
Maybe in 100 years. Okay? But things like this move very, very slowly. Okay? They move very slowly. And right now, we've taken like 3 steps back. So to gain that ground, this presidency has to be over to go back to another president who undoes some of the damage that has been created by this guy and his minions. So it's going to be a long while before we're on equal footing. And there's a lot of work for all of us to do.
Yes, absolutely.
A more benign area.
But sadly, if you look at how Hollywood has portrayed Latinos and in particular Mexicans, you know, it's not a good picture. There's that documentary, what's it called, Bronze Hollywood, I believe, where it just historically lays out just how Hollywood has been a disservice to, and it still is, to many Latino communities, beginning with Mexican Americans. And that's always a concern, because Hollywood is, if you will, a window to the world, and the world sees the United States and all its, right, and all its colors and so forth. So when they see us in Hollywood, we're portrayed as the villains, the perpetual villains. We are, like the Germans in Hollywood, we are the boogeyman, and therefore, that's a concern, because those are the projections that we have no control over, and people misidentify that.
Equality Index score. The findings indicate striking disparities in conditions for blacks in Los Angeles compared to other major ethnic groups. Among the 4 major ethnic groups in Los Angeles, blacks, Asians, Latinos, and whites, blacks had the lowest Equality Index score, 69 for blacks versus 98 for Asian, 71 for Latinos, and 100 for whites, determined by a compilation on data on economics, housing, health. Key findings indicate disparity between blacks and other ethnic groups. 44% of black high schoolers fail to graduate with their class in 4 years. Blacks have the highest rate of homelessness and are estimated to be 30% or more of the country's homeless population. Blacks have the highest overall death rate and nearly double the rate of Latinos, with rates far higher than other groups for heart disease, homicide, and HIV/AIDS. Blacks receive longer prison sentences than other groups. For blacks, the average sentence for violent offenses is 46 months, compared to 39 months for Latinos and just 13 months for whites. Blacks have the lowest median household income at $31,905, compared to Latinos at $33,820 and whites at $53,978. Any final words on income equality and racial equality?
Well, being a father and hoping that this country betters itself in terms of the racial equality, that's what I look forward to. Those are my hopes and aspirations. I want all our children to inherit a better place, and all of us have a very important part of that process, so that we have to deconstruct how we have been led to feel about each other, whether it's us about whites or us about blacks or Asians. We have to really start chipping away at that, because it's hurting us, as a country. But again, will we reach racial equality? Those are my hopes and aspirations for all of us. One day, if we're not parents yet, well, we will be. If we're parents, well, maybe we'll be grandparents one day. And what is the legacy we're leaving behind for those unborn generations? That's at the heart of the matter. Will we be a much more unified world here, or much more divided? And that's not good. So I'm hoping that we get closer to racial equality.
So the National Latino Media Council was the entity that signed memorandums of understanding with ABC, NBC, CBS, and Fox. And what that meant, that the MOUs said to each one of these networks that they had to provide us with the numbers of Latinos, blacks, Asian Pacific Americans, and Native Americans twice a year. We've been doing that for some time, and we've encouraged them to up the numbers. If the numbers are bad now, you can just imagine how they were when we started. We started at 1.3 or 2% of Latinos in front of camera. So we have worked tirelessly through that organization that has all those individual organizations to get more traction, to put more pressure on the networks, and now the film industry. So it's a very legitimate, it's a very good organization, because there's several organizations, not just one. Like I said to you a few minutes ago,
Yes.
We were only about 2% of the speaking roles on television when we started. We're now at 6%. Now, I wish I could tell you that's a great number, but it's not. We're 18% of the U.S. population. So to have 6% representation is a travesty of justice. If you go to film, it's even worse. It's 3.1% of the speaking roles in front of starring roles in front of camera. So, either way you put it, Latinos are at the very bottom of the pile right now.
Employment discrimination. Employment discrimination laws will be necessary for some time and will have to be combined with policies that reverse decades of disaccumulation in black and Latino communities. The authors of the 1965 Voting Rights Act assumed that the social changes necessary to dismantle centuries of legal segregation would not be possible unless equality in political representation and influence was guaranteed. The Voting Rights Act sets off a political revolution in the South and remains, like employment discrimination law, one of the pillars of the Civil Rights Revolution. So to the question, will racial equality ever be achieved by law? Some are very optimistic that many things have changed over the decades, and some feel nothing will be different. Time will tell.